Cool, well welcome if you've just slipped in as we were singing. Great to be together for Dwell. Today we're on Why We Have Bishops. If you haven't got a handout, there are more at the back. And it'd be useful to have a Bible and a pen if you want to scribble things down. Hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. So do have a think. And if I don't cover the reason that you're here, if you've got a burning question, then we still have plenty of time to talk about that at the end. Well, who wants bishops? I don't see a flurry of hands going up in the air. Who wants bishops? I think it's a particular question at the moment because I don't know if it's always been like this for many hundreds of years, but certainly at the moment there's a lot of bad press about bishops, isn't there? I mean, you would have seen many of these headlines. Scandalous headlines abound when it comes to bishops. Just this last month, I'm sure you've seen on the news that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, was forced to resign in shame. As far as I can gather, that's the first time an Archbishop of Canterbury has ever had to do that. Admitting his role in covering up an investigation in child abuse. Serious stuff. Tragically, he's far from the first bishop to fall, though, is he? I mean, you would have seen maybe many of these cases over the years. Scandalous headlines might well put us off bishops. Secondly, you might know that 26 members of the House of Lords are what are called Lords Spiritual, bishops from the Church of England. They get an automatic role in the House of Lords. Now, is that a good thing? Well, we're not here to talk about politics. That's not my area at all. Is that a good thing? Well, many people don't think so, and there are, of course, increasing calls for reform in that area as well. But even many Christians, in fact, even many Anglicans, don't seem to want bishops either. This is some of the stuff I just found from a quick look at a number of Christian publications online, Christian newspapers and things. Often calls to cut the number of bishops. More anecdotally, I guess, and culturally in a lot of more evangelical churches, because many of the bishops famously are straying a long way from what the Bible says, in terms of the authority of the Bible, particularly how that plays out today in sexual ethics, many people just don't want anything to do with their bishop. So they would rather live as if we don't really have a bishop. So who wants bishops? Clearly not, well, a lot of people don't very much. Now, as we begin this session this afternoon, this whole area of church polity, that's a word, I don't know if you use it in your average week, polity, how something is governed, how churches are governed, that has been one of the most contentious issues in the church for 2,000 years. Lots of people have killed each other over it. So let's try not to do that this afternoon, yeah? We're here as friends, aren't we? Christ is family, we love each other, and we just want to pursue what's good and true and beautiful together, don't we? But like I said last year, it is important how we approach these contentious issues. I just want to repeat that in case you weren't here last week. No one has nailed this issue, how churches are governed. It's complex. People land in various positions. There are strengths and weaknesses in every way of doing it. Now, the cynical view on this whole topic would be everyone's just power hungry. Yeah? Power corrupts. Power's bad. People are always abusing power. So anything that sort of has a hint of power or authority about it is probably a bad thing, right? That's kind of one generally quite cynical approach to this whole area. And the sad thing is there's some truth in that, as the headlines show. The broader view would be to say, yeah, there's truth in that, but this whole area is really complicated. And the details, here's the crucial thing, I think, the details are not specifically mandated in Scripture. What we have in the Bible is not a manual for how to organise church. And so we don't have a lot of these specifics, hence the complexities around this area. Now, before we dive in, one more caveat from me to clarify what I'm not talking about. I'm not really going to go into the whole political state establishment sort of side of things. Again, I'm not a politician. I don't really understand lots of it. The role of bishops throughout history has often ended up being combined with secular leadership, like the Lord's spiritual. This is often connected, of course, to the role of the Church of England as the established church in this country, the state church with the monarch as its head. it's complicated, isn't it? For the last few hundred years in England, there have been many very godly, very thoughtful, very biblical non-conformists, those who want to separate out the church and the state. I'm not going to go into all of that. Okay, this isn't really about conformity, established religion, all of that. Instead, we're going to focus on a biblical kind of bishop, what's so good about that, and why we can enjoy and benefit from that today in our denomination. It's a really good thing. That's what we're going to do. Hope that's okay. So first, do follow along with the handout. Bishops are biblical. Might surprise you to hear me say that, might surprise you to hear anyone say that, but the concept is biblical. Let's open up a couple of verses. Titus chapter 1. So you probably know towards the end of the Bible you've got what are sometimes called the pastoral epistles, Titus and 1 and 2 Timothy. They're not a textbook for how to govern a church, but they're the closest you get. There is a lot on that very topic, how to order things, and certainly what was needed there and then, from which we can get lots of principles and wisdom for now. So see how the Apostle Paul writes to Titus in chapter 1, verse 5. He says, "The reason I left you in Crete..." Sorry, this is page 901, if you haven't yet found it. These little letters are hard to find sometimes, aren't they? 901. Paul says to Titus, "The reason I left you in Crete was that you might put in order what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town, as I directed you." So the era of the apostles is coming towards an end. What are they going to do next? How are we going to put things in place? Well, the apostles start writing to people like Titus saying, you guys need to appoint elders, or the same word as ordain. Appoint, ordain, same word. Elders, church leaders, presbyters in towns to run the churches. Who's going to do that? In this case, Titus. He's not the pastor of those churches, but he's going to appoint pastors for those churches. And the word there, appoint elders, that is the word presbyters, from which you get the denomination Presbyterian, about their organisation of leaders like this. So presbyter, elder, same word. But then another common word used for church leaders is, in Greek, episkopos, which is normally translated overseer. So if you turn back to 1 Timothy chapter 3, a few pages, 896. Here, Paul says to Timothy, 1 Timothy 3, verse 1, "Here's a trustworthy saying, whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task." Overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, etc. He's describing what should be required of a church leader, a minister or a presbyter. And that word overseer is episkopos, which is the word bishop. That became the Latin word episkopos or something, which became bishop. It's like in the middle of the word, isn't it? Piskop. It's in that word. Okay, that is the word bishop. You could translate it, whoever aspires to be a bishop aspires to a noble task. Now, you also have the word minister or servant or pastor, just once, interestingly. But a lot of these words are kind of interchangeable in the New Testament. Overseer, presbyter, minister, they're all elder, they're all kind of referring to the same sort of role. And overseer is a helpful translation, because that's the key role of a pastor of a congregation, to oversee their spiritual well-being. It's also the key work of a bishop, which is a bit like Titus, someone who oversees the appointment of pastors or ministers in other places as well. So overseeing, that's the key word, overseeing. So the question is, well, what will that overseeing look like? And that's where discussion can take place and where we might reach different conclusions. But that word overseer does appear several times, and that's simply the word bishop. Now, secondly, B, a variety of leadership roles is biblical. We all know that. That's not controversial or debatable. Ephesians 4 talks about pastor teachers, apostles and prophets, evangelists. The New Testament churches have various kinds of leaders. So the apostles planted churches, traveled around to strengthen them, to recognize and appoint other leaders, to safeguard faithful gospel teaching. And then the next generation, people like Timothy and Titus, they also pastored churches, appointed leaders, safeguarded faithful gospel teaching. And then you do get this growing kind of category or group of people who become known as the bishops. who do exactly that. They're kind of continuing what Timothy and Titus were doing, overseeing the pastors, pastoring the pastors. He had less official roles as well in the New Testament: prophets, evangelists, teachers. We don't know so much about those really, but there we go. That's a topic for another time. Over the page, applying these biblical roles requires wisdom. So, if you were to read Philippians, you'll notice that Paul addresses it to the church along with the overseers and deacons. Philippians 1:1. To all God's holy people in Christ Jesus, together with the overseers and deacons. And that seems to be those leading the church in Philippi. Well, how? I mean, who ordained those leaders? What was required of them at their ordination? Well, there's lots we don't know about the specifics of these church leadership roles. Or Acts 14, you can read about Paul and Barnabas appointing elders again in each church, committing them to the Lord. Well, how many elders? How many in each church? Was it just one to start with? Was it always several? Did Paul and Barnabas have to confer with anyone else? Did the congregations have a say? Did they take up references? There's lots of things we just don't know. We don't know how these kind of biblical offices were played out from the very earliest days. Or Titus 1, again, that one where he says, I left you there in Crete to finish what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town. Well, how did that work? What was the liturgy for those ordination services? Do you put an elder there before you start a church? Do you need several to start a church? A lot of things we don't know exactly. It requires wisdom to implement the biblical roles that we see. So, as in almost every area of life, the Bible doesn't specify exactly how to do things. Rather, it teaches us how things were done, and we have to read it carefully with faith, interpret it carefully with prayer, and seek to live it out carefully with wisdom. Now, praise God, isn't it amazing to think that the age of the apostles, ever since then, they lit a candle in the church that has never gone out in 2,000 years. That's pretty awesome, isn't it? And across that whole time, various leadership models and structures were bound to appear and develop. And so we would need to figure some things out with time, seeking godly wisdom and common sense. Now, the fact that serious and faithful Christians over the centuries have reached different conclusions about this should help us to see that it is a secondary issue. And so we should pause before deciding that all the details of our particular way is the biblical way. We should probably all be quite slow to say that. But that's not to say that it's a free-for-all. We should just do whatever we want. Because as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 14, everything should be done in an orderly way. That's a good and important principle, isn't it? What will help the church to order itself well? What will be a good and wise and beautiful way to do that? Next, part of what will help us to do that, D, is that it is biblical to ordain people to their office. We've seen that a couple of times already, to ordain or to appoint people. Office, you might be in lines of work where you talk about certain people having an office. It's a little bit weird, isn't it? It's not about a room with a desk chair. It's about a position of responsibility and authority. And, of course, the Old Testament leaders were ordained or appointed to their offices. The New Testament, things do change because the people of God no longer live in a theocracy where the king is God's given ruler for his people on earth. Rather, the church is scattered now. 1 Peter 1. The church is scattered amongst the nations now. But even so, local churches are meant to have leaders ordained, appointed. You see it in Acts 14. You see it in Titus 1. So, let's look again at who appointed these church elders in the New Testament. Because we don't know in every case, but we do read of instructions being given to Timothy and Titus. So 1 Timothy 5, Paul says, don't be hasty in the laying on of hands. That refers to the ordination ceremony. Titus 1, appoint elders in every town. And just as the apostles and their partners did, Paul and Barnabas, ordaining in Acts 14, Jerusalem, apostles and elders oversaw elders elsewhere and churches elsewhere. So you do get these little hints and mentions of people sort of ordaining leaders for other places. What they seem to be doing is finding trusted, tried and tested church elders, but then a number of them over time seem to somehow end up in this kind of wider overseeing role, a wider external role, overseeing appointment of other church elders for the future. So that is what you see when you begin to look at the church history, which is fascinating. A lot of this stuff, by the way, I'll put some quotes on your handout. A lot of these things are just freely available online. It's so cool to read people like Ignatius, even in the first and second centuries, writing to churches like the Ephesian church, just like Paul did. You're like, oh yeah, that's like the next generation or two. That's really cool. So anyway, if you want to do something a bit different one evening, check out Ignatius online. And just look at what he said. This guy, by the way, was most likely discipled by the Apostle John. And here's what he says. And that may be a little bit what he looked like. All these guys just had amazing beards, which puts me to shame. But there we go. Wherefore, it is fitting that you should run together in accordance with the will of your bishop, which thing also you do. For your justly renowned presbytery, that is a kind of group of presbyters, elders, worthy of God, is fitted as exactly to the bishop as the strings are to the harp. Therefore, in your concord and harmonious love, Jesus Christ is sung. What a lovely picture. He's saying, you've got this brilliant, godly, united team of elders, and they're strung together with a harp. Like, think of the frame of a harp, sort of holding those strings nice and tight. And then he says, therefore, Jesus Christ is sung beautifully. It's a lovely picture of a kind of complementary role between a presbytery, a group of local elders, and a bishop. Interesting. He goes on to say, be careful to be subject to the bishop and the presbyters and the deacons. So do you see what's happened? Even by, I don't know what year this would be, it's the end of the very first century maybe. He died in 108. Already there's a sense that, you have deacons and presbyters in your church, but then there's also a bishop, one of the overseers, who's become a sort of a slightly different role. For he that is subject to these is obedient to Christ, who has appointed them. But he that is disobedient to these is disobedient to Jesus Christ. There we are. So very early on, you've got this sense of deacons, presbyters, and bishops. Dr. Martin Davey is a church historian who's done a huge amount of research into all of this, and he summarizes what was going on like this. So from the very start of the 2nd century until its end, the threefold order of bishops, presbyters, and deacons was in existence across the Christian world. There is no church we know of where it does not seem to have existed. Wow, interesting. During the 2nd century, the term bishop, episkopos, was used exclusively to refer to a single individual who had ministerial oversight over the elders, deacons, and lay people of a particular church. Furthermore, all the writers who comment on the subject see episcopacy, that is, there being bishops, as apostolic in origin, with writers such as these guys with funny names testifying to unbroken lists of bishops in the churches going back to apostolic times. So a couple of hundred years later, you get Jerome. Here we are. So he writes, when he's commenting, he's writing a Bible commentary like you might use in your quiet times, maybe differently in those days, not so much literacy and press, but anyway, he was still commenting on the Bible. Titus 1, on that verse about appointing elders, here's what he says. The presbyter is the same as the bishop. Same word, remember? Episkopos, overseer. And he really helpfully, because by this point, remember, it's fairly established, but he helpfully sort of adds a bit of balance to it all. So the presbyter is the same as the bishop, and before parties had been raised up in religion by the provocations of Satan, the churches were governed by the senate of the presbyters. But as each one sought to appropriate to himself those whom he had baptized, instead of leading them to Christ, it was appointed that one of the presbyters, elected by his colleagues, should be set over all the others and have chief supervision over the general well-being of the community. Without doubt, it's the duty of the presbyters to bear in mind that by the discipline of the church, they are subordinated to him who has been given them as their head, but it is fitting that the bishops on their side do not forget that if they are set over the presbyters, it is the result of tradition and not by the fact of a particular institution by the Lord. I think that's really helpful because there's a few interesting things going on there. One, he notices that bishops kind of became a thing because of false teaching. Did you notice that? These kind of parties of Satan getting in there and causing issues. And so the presbyters, the church pastors, like, guys, there's some crisis going on here. Who's going to help us kind of order what's going on? And they choose between them one of the presbyters to become a sort of more senior overseer. And that's just what happens, isn't it? If there's a bunch of people in a room trying to organise something, you kind of just need someone to take a bit of a lead and make it happen. So even though these presbyters are all equally presbyters, somehow they figure out a system so that one of them is sort of chosen to become a bishop, more of an overseer for them. Interestingly, he also mentions sort of factions developing. Did you notice that? These sort of people who are saying, oh, I led this guy to Christ, come and follow me. It's just like in 1 Corinthians where there are these factions appearing, different crowds of churches following different people. And so because of that division, again, they need a bit of order and a bit of discipline, perhaps. Someone to sort of keep an eye on this group of presbyters. So there we go. That's quite a helpful quote there. Bishops shouldn't get above their station. That's very clear in that quote as well, isn't it? He's saying you're just a presbyter like the rest of us. You've just been given a particular role. Now, skip on many years, because basically, clearly from this time on, bishops were just the thing. Okay, it's how churches did things, basically. I mentioned last week the Reformation, so 1500s, 1600s, across the whole of Europe, politically, socially, culturally, religiously, everything is like being thrown up into the air. Huge time of change. John Calvin, one of the 2 or 3 most significant theologians of that whole period. Interestingly, he is known as the sort of forefather of Presbyterianism. Okay, like Reformed theology, continental, European, and quite seen as quite different often from like the English church and Anglicanism. But actually, turns out Calvin was quite pro-bishops, which is quite interesting. So in the Institutes, this is massive work, he says this, and he's basically looking back at the early church, a bit like we did just now. He says, all therefore to whom the office of teaching was committed, they called presbyters, and in each city these presbyters selected one of their number to whom they gave the special title of bishop, lest, as usually happens, from equality dissension should arise. The bishop, however, was not so superior in honour and dignity as to have dominion over his colleagues, but as it belongs to a president in an assembly to bring matters before them, collect their opinions, take precedence of others in consulting, advising, exhorting, guide the whole procedure by his authority, and execute what's decreed by common consent, a bishop held the same office in a meeting of presbyters. He says a bit later, to the government thus constituted the government of the church, that is, to the government thus constituted, some gave the name of hierarchy. Interestingly, even back in the 1600s, hierarchy wasn't a very sexy, popular word. He says, a name, in my opinion, improper, certainly one not used by Scripture. For the Holy Spirit designed to provide that no one should dream of primacy or domination in regard to the government of the church. But if, disregarding the term, we look to the thing, we shall find that the ancient bishops had no wish to frame a formal church government different from that which God had prescribed in his word. I think, again, that's so helpful because often, we've got to be honest, the role of bishops is abused. You end up with like super powerful, like unchallengeable people, and you think, well, how on earth did they end up with so much power? This seems completely inappropriate for the church. It doesn't look much like just another presbyter like the rest of the pastors. What's gone on? And that's exactly what Calvin was commenting on 500 years ago. They shouldn't dream of primacy or domination. And they're just meant to be a humble servant like everyone else. So Calvin recognises that both the selection of bishops by other presbyters and also more congregational churches were developing throughout the ancient church. And he accepts that there are pros and cons to both, basically. But it is interesting that as Calvin was such a vocal role at this crucial time in history, and he's saying, like, it's all going to be a bit messy, Nothing's going to be perfect, but this most ancient tradition and habit seems to be most commendable. Now, as the centuries rolled on, last few hundred years, it's been far from plain sailing, has it? We must recognise that the church across the world throughout history has had a very mixed history of bishops, as have Anglicans in particular. There have been many terrible bishops, many who live a godly life, who are a blessing to pastors, just like there have been many terrible preachers and fantastic preachers, terrible pastors. Keep reforming, to keep improving, to keep seeking God's mercy and God's help. Throughout Anglican history, all the way back to the very earliest centuries, which I spoke about last week. So from the very earliest centuries of the Anglican Church, that is the church in England, he recognises two main streams. One initially generally influenced by Rome. So think of the Holy Roman Empire, those early centuries, kind of dominating everything. But also in England, you had another stream more generally influenced by Celtic Christianity. And so the Celts in Britain, the Scots and the Irish and things, they seem to have a slightly different approach to the very top-down Roman approach. So the Roman approach was more organisational, right, institutional. They would focus on planning for long-term growth, setting up structures. They had their org charts going and all of that. They were like, work out the structure. That's what we need to do. Let's put some bishops there. Let's put some monasteries in. Let's work out all the structures so that the church can grow. Right? That's the more Roman approach. The Celtic approach is very different. It's more organic. Their approach to Christianity was more kind of based on the idea of living as a Christian pilgrim through this world, living simply, sitting loose to the things of this world, focusing more on the message and trusting that structures could follow in due course. And these two streams, it's really interesting. I think you can trace them all the way through the history of Christianity in England, even up to today. The more kind of organisational top-down approach and the more organic, humble, word-based approach. You could argue that there's basically the high church, low church thing is another example of it. In the modern era, so 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, there was huge expansion of the Anglican Church, wasn't there? Often intertwined with the British Empire, which is another whole complicated area. Sometimes this colluded with abuse and atrocities. Other times it brought life and peace and blessing. So very complicated. But again, at that time, you had the more kind of Anglo-Catholic stream with missionary societies like the SPCK, the SPG, more organisational again. So they were huge in many parts of Africa and Asia, establishing structures, monasteries, bishops, all that sort of stuff. And the church becomes this very sacred institution. But then you also have the more evangelical stream, organisations like CMS or BCMS, which became Crosslinks. A more organic approach. The church is a community formed by the gospel. Now, I think this is really interesting because it connects to bishops, because the more organisational approach, the more top-down Roman approach, is where you select like a missionary bishop to go off and start a new institution who establishes structures and churches so that the gospel can bear fruit. But then the more organic approach would be to just basically send anyone who loves the Lord. And they can go and preach the gospel, great, God bless them. Anyone who's willing, and you'll see conversions, you'll see churches planted, you can deal with structures in due course. So I hope that makes sense. I think it'd be interesting, just turn to a neighbour, which do you think is better and why? Okay, the more organisational kind of Roman approach, set up the structures, then things can grow. or the more Celtic, organic approach, just preach the gospel. Structures can come later. Which do you think is better and why? Have a chat. Okay, can we share a couple of things? There might be quite a few different thoughts going around the room, so let's start this side of the room. One or two people want to share anything they were talking about? Go on.
Depending on the location, would it depend going to like Afghanistan compared to Scotland or somewhere? We kind of thought both could work. Organic might be a bit more welcoming, a bit more like chill, whereas structurally it might feel like a bit more rigid. Who knows?
Cool. Okay, yeah. So you can see pros and cons of both.
Yeah.
Different contexts perhaps might lend themselves better to different approaches. Yeah. Cool. Anything else? Anything a bit different? Anyone else was talking about? Similar things?
We didn't really land on a conclusion,
Yeah.
but we were just trying to think through what are the things that we're commanded to do, or like what's God's kind of strategy plan for reaching people and for building up His church. So I suppose that there's two sides of things. Like the obvious thing is God tells us just go and preach the gospel to all nations. So there's that command, but then there's also the kind of God's method of local churches being that kind of city on a hill, light to the nations there as well. So it doesn't really give you any conclusions, but it's just like the way that we were thinking.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Yeah, so there are New Testament texts that speak to both approaches. Thank you. Yeah, great. Anything else on this side of it? Anything a bit different? Anyone else talking about? Go on, Dave.
We sort of drew on the analogy of a startup versus an institution.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
build it and they will come is one approach.
Right.
Or just find your first customer, build a use case around it. So I was thinking just now about we're not just happening to get this thing out, we're planning it very well.
Yeah.
So it's more like the bishop approach. It's only Bishop Johnny Overhat. It's planned, we're doing it diligently. We're not just like organic, it's all, it might feel like church, but we're planning and doing diligently.
Yeah.
It's not just like ad hoc happening.
Yeah.
Planning and structured.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. And you can say the same for, I guess, our experience at CCB, that we're trying to incorporate both, hopefully, perhaps. Any other thoughts?
I mean, I would add, I think there's room for both, and it's dependent on the situation and the context. So, in some situations, you might think the wise thing to do is let 1,000 flowers bloom, and then you might learn things, and as a result of that, might facilitate your thinking to say, right, we know that works, that doesn't work, so let's be a bit more structured about it. Yeah? Or you could go in with a more structured approach and actually say, okay, we're going to do this, and it has some benefit, or it doesn't. So you have to be agile. I think you can use both. So, for example, with Hackbridge, to go back to what you're saying, we have thought through some key steps we want to get to, or milestones, if you want to look like. But in terms of actually the monthly meetings that we have, we'll see what comes out of those, won't we? So it's both.
Yeah.
I think also when we think of Jesus and the disciples, when he sends out the disciples, they were fishermen, they weren't people who were really well trained in the Bible, but they were just sent out to go and preach the word. And then Andy made the point of then once it hits like that number, what do you do with so many people, because you can't just keep growing without any structure, because it's just going to get hectic, there's going to be false preaching or whatever, and it can become really disarrayed and can actually lead to something a lot more dangerous. But that initial kind of going out, you need people who are really driven for the Lord, even if perhaps, we hope that they know the Bible.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Cool. Okay, well, it's interesting, isn't it? And I think it's, I found it really interesting to see a good historian observing these two streams, like all the way back to the very earliest days of the church in England. And the two are very much still going today. And unsurprisingly, the path of wisdom is probably to see a bit of both. But I think just helpful as a bit of a diagnostic to recognise that some of us may have had much more of one emphasis in our backgrounds as well. And that will probably colour the way we approach this whole topic. But finally, let me just say something about bishops in AME today. So last little bit on the handout, because this is us now. You've born with another sort of history lesson, but let's come up to speed today, because here we are, we're in an Anglican church, in the Anglican mission in England, with 2 ordained ministers by the Anglican mission in England. We have our bishop, Bishop Tim Davies, who lives in Sheffield. He'll be speaking at our weekend away later this term. So it's really helpful to see, well, how do we benefit from that? Well, how does this actually play out on the ground? Because this might actually be quite different, again, from your experience in the past. Amy is relatively new, so it probably is a bit different, because you may have been part of a Church of England church, you may have never seen your bishop, you may have been connected to a bishop who wasn't really technically your bishop. There are all sorts of funny workarounds going on these days. You may have been from a tradition or denomination that doesn't have bishops. So, what does our bishop do? Well, again, as you look at the New Testament, you do get a few hints of what those external overseers do. First, they did their own pastoral ministry. So again, think of Titus and Timothy. As well as appointing these other elders, they were doing their own pastoral ministry. So they were on the job themselves. They were pastors themselves. Then you see them being commanded by Paul to show discipline to other elders regarding their teaching. So a kind of really important check on doctrinal truthfulness, but also on the lives of ministers in particular. You see that 1 Timothy 1 and Titus 1. You also see the call to them to live an exemplary life. That's big in the pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy 4 and Titus 2, live an exemplary life. So their own pastoral ministry, disciplining elders, living a godly life, and that is what we want to see in Amy. And I've been really encouraged to be part of it these last few years. There's an Amy paper that the bishops wrote just 2 years ago, I think it was, on the 3 orders of ordained ministry, so deacons, presbyters, bishops, which spells out that they kind of stack on top of each other. It's not like you are promoted from one to the other, and then you're no longer what you were before. If you were here when I was ordained deacon, which happens a bit before you're ordained presbyter, you might remember Bishop Andy saying, I am a deacon myself, because he hasn't moved on from that role. He still sees himself as a deacon, a servant, but then you're given additional responsibilities when you become a presbyter, and additional responsibilities again when you're a bishop. So that's good that they kind of build on top of each other. But let's look at these areas of how we benefit. First, interconnectedness. So humans are interconnected, aren't they? We all know that. No man's an island. And in the New Testament, you see churches partnering together in various ways, supporting each other, sending gifts to each other, sending messengers and encouragement to each other. You see that in Acts 9, 2 Corinthians 8, and many places. Now, some denominations will still want to do that without bishops. But the vast majority have had bishops throughout history, and for the sake of unity. It's what we saw in some of those quotes earlier, wasn't it? And this is to keep people together for mutual encouragement, service, and fruitfulness, so that we don't keep dividing, or fracturing, or splintering. Bishops really are meant to keep the church together. Now, if you operate in a denomination without bishops, you'll still want to work together with other people, and so you'll end up forming some kind of regional groupings or national groupings. That's what often happens, with some kind of leadership again. And you basically end up with people who look an awful lot like bishops. They're just not called bishops. So there is this interconnected desire that we all have. And the question is, well, who's going to do it? And how are we going to appoint them properly, consistently, and so on? So interconnectedness, but also as well as connectedness to other churches in our denomination, there's also the brilliant global interconnection. So Bishop Andy Lyons, but also Bishop Tim, Bishop Lee, they're always travelling around the world, like connecting with other Anglicans around the world who are trying to hold fast to the gospel, often in the fierce heat of persecution and poverty, all sorts of amazing Anglicans around the world that they are connected with, standing shoulder to shoulder with, and that we get connected with. So interconnectedness is a great benefit. Secondly, example. So remember, the big part of the calling in the pastoral epistles is setting an example in discipleship and in ministry. And that is exactly what our bishops do, I'm pleased to say. When we have Zoom calls as Amy ministers or Amy leaders across the country, it's the bishops who take the lead in teaching, in prayer, in demonstrating their lives that they're trying to live. And their example is brilliant. I'm so blessed by it. They frequently and explicitly reject just a kind of managerial role. That's not how they see themselves. No, they often talk about a relational episcopacy. And that has been my good experience. So a godly example is a great benefit from our bishops, and I'm sure you'll enjoy meeting Tim in March. Thirdly, pastoring pastors. This is huge. Was it Jerome? I can't remember. One of those quotes we read earlier spoke about this, how this is how what the bishops ended up doing, pastoring the pastors. And I personally have been so blessed by this. Again, if you don't formally have a bishop doing it, you'll probably try to find someone else to do it. The question is, well, who? Who's going to do it? And I mentioned last week a particularly encouraging conversation I had a few weeks ago with Bishop Tim. What a blessing that was. This last whole year or so, as I've prayed and planned and prepared towards church planting with others here at CCB, having the bishops to call and speak to and pray with has been amazing. 2 of them have planted churches themselves. The other has been a missionary in South America. It's brilliant, their pastoring. Hearing from them on regular calls at our conference has been very inspiring and encouraging. This is so good and important, and this isn't just like good for me and Andy. The best gift Andy and I can give to you as our congregation is our spiritual health and well-being. And that is why it's so crucial to have someone pastoring pastors, to look after them. Without that, we are in a danger zone. So a huge part of the bishop's job is to look after us. I'm grateful for that, and I think you should be too. Fourth, accountability. Because along with that comes accountability. Now, you'll know that at CCB we have internal accountability for our leaders. So we have a plural eldership. We have Andy and me as ordained ministers by our bishop. But then we also have other lay elders, and the AME constitution makes room for that. That plurality of leadership is a massive safeguard and is so helpful. And for us, let me just say, there really is a true and healthy balancing of power in the elders team, and it's brilliant. Andy and I don't have the loudest voices. Everyone very much has an equal say. We're very free to correct each other, to challenge each other, to call each other out, to suggest changes. It's brilliant. But even that is not enough, because you can easily end up, even with a plural leadership, with factions of elders. You could have factions competing and falling out. You could end up with a plurality, but who are all just yes men to the biggest personality in the room. A plurality doesn't guarantee health. And what hugely strengthens healthy plural leadership and internal accountability is good and healthy external accountability as well. So our Bishop Tim can be called upon at any time by any of our lay elders if they have a concern. Tim is neutral. He's not. This isn't his church, so there's a helpful degree of neutrality and distance there. And he does have power when it's needed. So it's carefully held and limited. But should things ever escalate and require it, he would have the power to remove my license or Andy's license, and that would trigger the beginning of an end of employment process in our contracts. That's been written into our contracts now. So what we try to do in AME is to have both healthy internal accountability and healthy external accountability. And that applies to anyone in the room and anyone at the church as well. That's why I'm really glad that you'll meet him again soon. You met a couple of the bishops at the ordinations. But for you to know him better, he's the guy you can call if you have an issue with anything in the leadership here. And this is so good and actually quite rare in evangelical Anglican churches in England. Because there is a massive danger of evangelical Church of England churches understandably distancing themselves a long way from their bishops. Because as I mentioned last week, the House of Bishops in the Church of England is in such a mess and drifted so far from the Bible. The late Mike Ovey, who was president of Oak Hill Theological College, excellent theologian, deeply pastoral, interestingly quite prophetic now in a number of the things he was writing about. So before many of these scandals kicked off in the UK church, he could see one of the roots of the issues that was producing it all. And he puts it like this. The pattern I think I see quite regularly is one of the monarchical presbyter, like a monarch. Not where the one presbyter does everything, but where authority begins and ends with him. I find it ironic that we often decry the principle of the monarchical bishop, but is this because we oppose the monarchy idea, or the fact that it's vested in the bishop and not the chief presbyter? So a lot of the people, he was involved in training and seeing if they'd been trained in church leadership, he could see this big problem developing of people distancing themselves from their bishops, and so ending up with this hugely unhealthy amount of power and authority just in themselves as the presbyter of a church. So massive danger if you don't have healthy structures for godly bishops around you. Legatus, similarly, works for the Church Society at the moment. They're in the Church of England, they're fighting for orthodoxy, they're doing an amazing job. I couldn't do it myself. I disagree on, I wouldn't do that. I'm glad to be out of the Church of England, but they're in there doing a good thing. And he puts it like this: there are clear confessional and institutional accountability structures over the minister, which are built into authentic Anglican polity. It's precisely because Anglicans are not actually congregationalists, who give significant powers to the congregational meeting, that it is dangerous to ignore and sideline these wider accountability structures, since ministerial accountability can therefore be removed altogether. Otherwise, what we could end up with is a strange pseudo-congregationalism focused on monarchical presbyters who can potentially become tyrannical mini-popes, free from any restraints either from above or below. Now, you may have been in evangelical Church of England churches where that has basically happened. And you can see why, can't you? Because the whole structure of Anglican polity is meant to be that you have helpful, healthy external accountability as well as good structures internally. So there we are. Lastly, quickly, two-way involvement. I just want to say get involved. Did you know you can be involved as a member of Christ Church Balham? The joining booklet that we wave around sometimes has that little thing to sign at the back. And one of the implications of that is that you're on the electoral roll, which means you can elect people to synod. So synod is like the gathering of representatives of all the AME churches. There are representatives from clergy, from ministers, but also from laity, non-ministers. And everyone there who's elected, representing the churches, gets to vote for the bishops. So get involved. It's not far removed and distant structural stuff. We really can be involved. And also they will bless us by their involvement as they care for your leaders, as they do confirmations. We can talk about that in questions a bit if you want. We're exploring whether we could start doing that at CCB. But also, of course, as they appoint and deploy leaders for the future, for healthy, gospel-centred Anglican churches in the future. So that two-way involvement is a great blessing. There we are. Let's finish there. Turn to somebody next to you and share if there's anything new you've learned about bishops, or any new or old questions you have about bishops. Let's have a little chat for a minute, then we can field some questions. Okay, should we come together? Do feel free to ask any questions. I'm not Yoda. I can't guarantee a wise answer, but I'll have a go, and Andy will probably jump in. Any questions at all about bishops? Yes, Sarah.
We just have a question about, at the beginning, you said that it's like the same word, basically.
Yeah.
Used in different places, and we obviously have different words that have been translated in our Bibles. But you said that it was the same word. If it's the same word, how have we then ended up with three different things?
Yeah. So thank you. So the word overseer in the New Testament translates episkopos, which is a different word from presbyteros, which means presbyter. So what I meant to say is that those two words are used fairly interchangeably. So presbyter and overseer are used fairly interchangeably. So you could translate it bishop, like Philippians 1:1, could be to God's holy people together with the bishops and deacons, but it seems to mean presbyters there. So,
A different.
initially then it seemed to mean local church leaders. But then what you see happen very quickly in the first century is those overseers of congregations seem to somehow elect one of them to become an overseer of the overseers.
Like Titus.
Yeah, that is,
You could call it Andy Bishop Andy.
This one?
Andy Palmer. According to that use of the word.
But, yeah,
Yes, you could have done originally, yeah, but no one uses it.
Only later
Yeah.
to use that word for that.
Yeah, no one really uses it like that anymore, but yeah, technically, yeah.
But importantly, our bishops are still basically just elevating presbyters.
Yeah, so they're still
It's
doing that
they're
role.
presbyters
Yeah.
with just a slight different role, because they're not just local congregational pastors like Tyndale's and Sheffield. He's also got this supra-congregational role. But it's a role. It's not like it's a complete third different being of thing. It's just a slightly elevated presbyter.
Yeah.
How often are they elected? Every year?
Yeah. So technically, it's not going to happen. Technically, this synod, everyone go, no, we don't want Tim Davies, we want Johnny Burgess as bishop. That could technically happen. It won't happen. That'd be a terrible idea. But it's not that terrible. But do you know what I mean? It could be. It's just an overseeing.
So, yeah, one of us presbyters to be more of an overseer of us.
It's a bit like appointing someone a chairman in a meeting for that particular meeting out of like the people on a trusteeship or something. Someone might chair a particular meeting. Is it a bit like that?
Yeah, sort of. But
Someone's almost like taking lead for that period of time.
Yeah, with a wider remit and wider role. Yeah. Yeah, Becky. Yeah.
I think what I find really confusing when I was saying this to Jules, like we talk about deacons.
Yeah.
So you have like you when Bishop Tim came in, he was a deacon. Then we also have like Caroline Holland.
Yeah.
And obviously she couldn't be a deacon like you're a deacon. And then you said about the AME structure, like the AME structure allows elders, as though AME wouldn't actually have elders, but we're allowed to have them. And it's like when we have, it's just when loads of them use really interchangeably, and then like children's talk on the turf.
Yeah, thank you. No, it is confusing. You're completely right. So the way Amy does it is you have some of the ordained presbyters who are elected to become bishops, so overseeing the overseers, as well as their local church roles. Then you also have people who have been ordained deacons, as I was before I was ordained presbyter. Now, Amy has recently concluded and written some papers on the fact that it would be really good to see that as more of a permanent calling for some people, not just a stepping stone towards being ordained presbyter. So, say for whatever reason, once I've been ordained deacon, I could have said, do you know what, I'm not sure I really want to be a church leader, actually. I'll just stick here, with this role that's been recognised by the wider church through the bishops. Well, no, this is still as an ordained deacon.
So what's the difference between an ordained deacon and Amy and an elder with us?
Okay, hang on. So then you have the ordained deacons and the ordained presbyters. Yeah. But then the Amy Constitution also allows flexibility on how that's played out at a local level. And so the ordained ministers or elders, presbyters, might well have other lay elders, like Christian, who are recognised as suitable, godly, gifted people to serve in that way. They're just not recognised by the Church Catholic, that is, having been ordained by a bishop, who is sort of connected to the whole Anglican global thing. In a similar way, you have deacons, who are local kind of lay deacons. So they're recognised by our church as suitable people to serve in that way. They haven't been ordained by a bishop.
And they can't do the same thing that you can do as a deacon, but then because Amy said you're a deacon, like so then you can preach and lead a church, but our deacons can't do that.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Would it help? So here's Christian. So Christian and I are both the elders of CCB. We're equal in authority and you're probably more because you're older. But do you know what I mean? But there's no difference between us here at CCV. The only difference is that Christian couldn't sort of up sticks and move to Cornwall and say, right, I'm an elder here now. I'm like, no, you're not.
Or Nigeria.
Or Nigeria, whereas I could. Because my authority, my orders have been recognised by the Church, Universal, the Church Catholic. That's the only difference between us is deployability. And that's why it's important that we do this, particularly for guys like Johnny, because they'll be deployed elsewhere. They're recognised more widely. So that's the only difference between lay elders and ordained.
Why don't we just go full on and get
Ordain them all.
elders already?
Yeah, that'd be great too.
Well, that was an option. It's just they don't that much for doing all the exam papers and essays.
So you're right. Get through the books then, isn't it?
We play that, Christian.
Yeah, you could.
It feels very inconsistent. I know we can live in inconsistency in policy because everybody does. But just go to full hold.
Yeah, you could in theory. Yeah, but it's nice. They've been helpful in the Constitution by recognising that is often how it works in local churches. Yeah, sure. Laurie, yeah.
I was kind of following on from that.
Yeah.
So in the church we have women that are deacons
Yeah.
and men that are deacons.
Yeah.
Can women become ordained deacons?
Yep.
So then it just means that they have the same role, but it's recognised. Like it's recognised by twice.
That's right. Recognised by the Church Catholic as gifted and called to serve in that way. James.
Who pastors the bishops and kind of probably maybe the archbishops?
Yeah, good question. I'd be interested to know how Tim would answer that. You'd have to ask him. I'm not sure what he would say. I expect he would say that they work hard to pastor each other as a little group, and they are connected to global teams of bishops through GAFCON and things like that.
And definitely fostered by one of the primates.
Right, yeah. Throw in some more jargon.
It's a big orangutan.
A primate is like like a leader of a whole province or something.
And what's a province? Like part of the world?
A massive area, geographical area with loads of Anglican churches. Well, the primate of the Church of England was Justin Welby.
So do we, Amy doesn't.
Well, we basically have Andy Lyons. He's the most senior bishop. So he would represent Amy as a primate, I think, amongst
So he's
other
senior of the
primates.
three?
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Yeah. Don't worry, it's fine. It's all very new and complicated. Keep the questions coming.
4 years old?
Yeah. And so inevitably, in the same way like the first century, so already like in Titus, it's like, oh great, we've got this church in Crete. Okay, it's growing a bit. Quick, elders, appoint elders, and then like the generation after that, quick, we need someone to oversee the elders, or let's call them a bishop, because they're overseeing everything. You see, like as things grow, structures evolve, but it's the principles behind it. So I don't think we need to be so. I like things neat, but the reality is the structures grow, as things grow, you need to adapt. Otherwise,
But each of those positions, the people who have been tested and perceived to be found to be very godly, in order to be recommended for those roles. That's the thing we shouldn't forget, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you, Jules. Yeah.
The tradition of James of Jerusalem.
Say it again.
James of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Like a proto-bishop.
Yeah, kind of. So Acts 15 seems to be doing that. Yeah. Go on, Phil, and then Connor. Yeah.
A question about like bishops travelling in their locality.
Yeah.
The dream to have them in on our doorstep. Which seems like, for Tim, if he's travelling a lot from Sheffield, from his own church a lot, and that we don't really know him. It's great that he's had a weekend away, but would the dream to be regional? Is that the ideal thing?
Yeah, it would be to be closer, regionally. And Amy's growing quite fast, and they're a year ago they were talking about trying to identify and raise up more bishops. So they're trying to sort of spread it out more. Yeah. Connor,
My question relates to that a little bit. I just think the relational episcopacy seems like a really good idea, but especially if they're the chief presbyter, so they have their own church.
Yeah.
Like, how can that actually function with enough relationships that you and Andy can't just pretend for a couple of conferences a year?
Pretend.
Pretend everything's going well.
Yeah. Okay.
And, be really related relational, just like it seems like exactly what you want, but what are the safeguards that just stop?
Well, I share how it works with me. So I get a 360 review every year, but every third year the bishop's CC'd into that, and he's involved in that. So that keeps him in the loop in that sense. And I guess on the discipline front, it's rightly, there's a proactive sense, but also there's a reactive sense. So if every third week, when the congregation member sees me or email the bishop saying, this guy says some really weird stuff, or he's doing some really weird stuff, you know, there'll be a lot more interest. Whereas sometimes it's just pastoral. It's me or Johnny having a question, calling him up, saying, "Hey, how do I do this?" Or "This is flagged up. Have you got any wisdom?" And
they have, James. Have you been given some sort of liaison role? Is that right? Or am I making that up? No. I think maybe it's on our to-do list. There's going to be some sort of bishop's point of contact amongst the local leadership. Yeah.
And you also have an every other week Zoom call where you have, I mean, I could go to that at training and actually talk to each other in small groups.
Yeah.
People, it's hard to hide when you have to talk about.
Yeah, so they could pick things up.
It's the thing I'm pursuing at the moment.
Go on, Robin, one or two more?
Yes, saying related to that, if there was sort of a horrific heresy that was going down at CCP, now it feels to me like the route through which any sort of discipline or pastoring of pastors or anything would actually happen is through permission. Partly because it seems that we have more contact with permission than we do with Amy, and it's obviously like you have a lot of some sort of visible contact and fraternity with other ministers and stuff within that. So I guess like what's the difference? Obviously there is the kind of Anglican-y bit. But like in reality, it feels like maybe I'd be more likely to go to someone in leadership with permission with the problem rather than
Yeah, you could do. And like we're really blessed by those connections, those relationships within Commission. Commission doesn't try to be a denomination, though, so it can't be involved in discipline, really. Like there could be, as a brother, but they don't really have teeth, like real. Well, it's complicated because we're also part of a charitable trust really crass. Yeah.
It'll have to be a really major moral or major theological error for me to form into discipline procedures for commission.
Yeah, I guess I'm not really talking about procedures as much as just like maybe this is something that needs to be talked about with someone who has a kind of pastoral or fraternal relationship with one of our ministers.
Yeah.
At my interview 7 years ago, Christian was there, and I was being interviewed by Richard Bacon, and I said, imagine me and Christian had a falling out or disagreement on this and that, who should we go? I expected him to say, well, we're commission, we're the legal entity to the apostle, come to me. He didn't say that. He said, well, we're Anglican church, you should go to your bishop. And he's right. So they deliberately, it's a church party network, not a denomination. They're not trying to see themselves as that. But legally, we're employed by that, so there are legal demands on it. But the bar for error, you know, it's quite high. For it to reach the 0.15 by commission, it actually needs to be quite crass. Whereas, rightly, for Amy, it's much lower. So if I'm doing not illegal stuff, but really dubious stuff, I could lose my license, which would trigger anything. Which triggers.
And it's an added bonus to be part of Commission, but obviously most Amy churches aren't. They're all over the country.
Yeah, so what actually happened is that when we joined Amy, we looked at our constitution, our relationship with Amy and our relationship with the Commission Charitable Trust. So essentially, if there is a disciplinary issue and we're not able to resolve it locally, we will involve the bishop, or the bishop will be involved. That could trigger Andy losing his licence. Yes, it would. It would trigger losing his licence because in the constitution that we signed as members of the CMCT, if you lose your licence,
you terminated. That's hard.
It's getting quite in the weeds, isn't it? Let's do one more from Becky, and then
I think that's actually a really good thing that we have two things.
Yeah.
I think I've been involved in churches, really closely that have had really bad experiences because they haven't had anything above them. So it is always a good thing that we have to.
Yeah, the more the better. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I want you guys to know this.
Yeah.
Because it might not be me. It might be 15 years' time. I mean, when I swear, or wherever it might be, 30 years' time, 40 years' time. My successor might be a nightmare, or my proof, or and you need these processes in place before disaster happens.
Yeah.
Because you may know churches, if you try to build your airplane and flying it, it's a nightmare.
Yeah. And these things are never going to prevent sin and problems, are they? That's our hearts. But we want to pursue wisdom and think, well, let's do whatever we can to promote health and good practice and order. So there we go. Quick one?
Yeah, very quick one. How would we reach out to Tim?
Yeah, great.
We did have a thing.
Bishop Tim Davies, Christchurch Central in Sheffield. Go to the website and you'll get his contact.
It must be on the Amy website too.
But Amy website as well. Yeah.
And in fact, there's a whole raft of people on the Amy website.
Yeah. Good. Well done, everyone. Maybe not everyone wanted all the details, but it's good to be transparent, I think, and just to say this is who we are, this is how we do things, this is why we think it's good. So there we are. We're going to sing. What did we choose for the last song? The Lord's My Shepherds. Excellent. There we are. However good or dubious or mixed our under shepherds are, the Lord is our great good shepherd, isn't he? So let's sing of him.